Overschande here. As you have heard, I'm quite a mediocre guitar player, if not to say the least. And today I would really like to know whether my terrible guitar play is the fact of me just not being talented or not practicing enough, which I can already know the answer, but I think it should help us to cover the big topic whether the innate talent exists or all the greatness is achieved through practice. Let's talk about it. Alright. I think our whole life we've been living with this idea of talent existing. You would hear someone regarded as a talent pretty much whenever they do something super successful, especially when it also goes to art, sports, or whatever, as we truly believe that these kind of things could not really be taught, but this is something that person needs to be born with the God's praise and blessing. The person would be able to achieve the highest merits in certain field. I do feel like this whole thinking creates more friction in the society than it probably was supposed to. It really simplifies the whole idea of success, to my opinion, and probably what we would be calling talent. I personally always determined is that talent is something that will help you to achieve like the highest possible levels. This is something that like you really need to be burned with. I think this is kind of was burnt in my mind throughout the times I've been on Earth, right? I've been born. It feels like the talent at this point, after thinking more about it and thinking it through, it feels the talent is the concept where people would describe certain failure that just preventing them from achieving the success or doing what they want. Because, it feels like how many times when you personally maybe saw it or you heard other people thinking is that when they're trying to do something and they are bad at it at the very beginning, as happens to most of us, they would probably just decide not to pursue this idea anymore, not to do this action anymore, just because they're not good enough, so perhaps they just don't have a talent for it, And while on one side it kind of sounds logical, because, right, we sometimes see people managing to achieve something great since the very beginning, since they just start, so it really feels like they're gifted, there's something with them that allows them to already do something great without much of an effort, as it seems. And there are other people whom it may cause a lot of difficulties. So here's the thing. I recently read a book called Pick by Anders Ericsson, and I wanted to first make a book review on it, but then I realized that I think it really embodies a huge topic and a huge matter of discussion where probably the podcast format would be more appropriate. Anders Ericsson spent a few decades studying the idea of deliberate practice, and talent, and how the mastery can be achieved. And he also was the person who indirectly created the 10,000 hour rule, which I think is really known nowadays. And as he also even mentioned in one of the parts of his book, is that some other author used it as a simple concept that will kind of be easier to sell to other people who really like struggling with some other things. And it's like it's been called in few different manners, right? I believe there is another concept of like reading 100 books on a specific topic and you would be a pro, and there is the more simple concept of 10,000 hour practice. While what Anders Ericsson is actually meant by mentioning the 10,000 hour rule is that when he was making studies about the violinists, those who usually make it to the Berlin Conservatory, one of the main musical conservatories in Europe at least, and perhaps in the world, those who seemingly having the highest potential out of the students, they managed to spend even more than 10,000 hours before achieving the age of 18, I believe, practicing playing violin. So they really started super early, and they were deliberately practicing multiple times a week, multiple hours, just in order to achieve the greatness. So this way, this myth of 10,000 hour rule was created, because what the author of the book really stresses is that just simply repeating the same thing, technically practicing the same and only thing without really having any thoughts about it, without really focusing on it, or just making something deliberate out of it, wouldn't help you to improve, because the repetition is not helping you to get better. And one of the examples as he was making was doctor's example. So one would usually think that a doctor who's been in the field for multiple decades, 20, 30 years, it should be like the highest level of the expertise, right? They should be much more proficient in what the younger doctors with maybe 3 to 5 years of experience would have. While Anders Ericsson saying is that usually it's likely be worse, because after achieving a certain level of proficiency, doctor is pretty much working on the autopilot, because most of the things, most of the complaints that they will be receiving will be super repetitive, so there is no need for them, there is no challenge for them to change the approaches. And only those doctors who continuously working with the experts, going on all these conferences discussing new ways and methodics of how to work and treat the patients in other manners, they may upkeep their level for a longer period of time, rather than those who, after achieving their mastery because they practiced certain thing for many hours, years, they may just not be as great as you would imagine. The whole book talks a lot about how the practice can actually enhance your abilities to do whatever, and there are many examples of more competing things like sports or arts, but not something that you could necessarily say is super creative. It is much easier to imagine practice making you better in certain fields whenever you can apply this certain specific algorithm which you can follow in order to get better. For example, one of the main examples in the whole book was chess, so there were a lot of examples from the chess players, there were a lot of examples from violinists, because that's where you need to achieve a good level of mastery in order to play the instrument. As you know, at the very beginning, there is quite a steep learning curve for those who want to play this instrument. And of course, it also coming into all the sports, where you technically may say that there may be some more advantages for those people who have different physical abilities from the very beginning, because this is not always something that you may train, and we always limited by our genes and by our body. But most of the things still are able to be achieved. And as I think I may have mentioned in the other book by Carol Dweck, Mindset, she was also citing the examples of Muhammad Ali or Michael Jordan. By their looks, by their athleticism level, but their build and composure, it wasn't necessarily people would have imagined that they would be able to achieve such a greatness, and they becoming a household name, as then those people who are even so far from this type of sports would still know who these people are. So even though maybe they didn't have the best physical abilities, their purposeful practice and the way they've been thinking and the way they've been doing their craft, their sports, allow them to pretty much become the legends of the sports in the specific field. Anders Ericsson showed in a really great example with one of the students he picked as the person to participate in the experiment they were making in the university, who would pretty much need to memorize the numbers. And at the very beginning, that student, he was struggling up until the point when we would usually at this point consider how much we can keep in our short memory, how much information we can keep in our short memory. So it is considered that we are able to keep up to like 7 units in our short memory in order to remember 7 units of information. So that is why pretty much for a long time Steve, I believe the student was called, couldn't really pass through the wall of remembering more than 7 or 8 digits that were told to him. So the whole idea of the experiment was he's hearing the number, he needs to reply back what he just heard, remembered, and then if he's doing this correctly, he receives additional number in the sequence. If he's not replying correctly, experimenter would go 2 numbers back. So for example, if he named 7, he goes correctly, he goes to 8. If he has a mistake while naming those 8, he goes back to 6, and so on and so forth. So for a long time, Steve wasn't able to break through the wall of 8 digits, and he was on the brink of giving up, and he actually at a certain point felt that maybe this is really the end of his abilities. But just because of the kind of person he was, and because he also was doing running as a sport, as part of his hobby, he was kind of competitive, so he really wanted to break through the wall. And then one day he actually managed, and he then achieved to like 13, 14 numbers, and then he went all the way to like 25 and 30 plus, and at a certain point one of his peak numbers in the sequence was 82 numbers in a row he was able to say. And he pretty much needed to come up with different mnemonic rules, so this will allow him to remember the groups of numbers and answer them back when he would need to. And one of the ways he created one of the simple rules is that he would allow himself to remember these numbers by applying what he loves the most, which is running. So sometimes he would consider a certain group of numbers as whether it's a good time for a 10-kilometer run or not, or maybe it's a great time for like 1 mile or whatever. So this was the way that it helped him to achieve to the certain points, and then of course he needed to come up with new mnemonic rules after this. So he was definitely applying the principle of purposeful practice, which is sort of big part of deliberate practice, the whole concept that Anders Ericsson was proposing and explaining the whole importance of it. So the purposeful practice in this specific case is that person who is practicing having a specific goal that is fully determined, and if we take the example of Steve, he clearly needed to name as many numbers as possible. So for example, if he named 7, his new goal would be to name 8 in a row. Then just because of him pretty much sitting during this experiment, he was getting the instant feedback, and this is super important for those who want to achieve like their practice level, because I believe I personally also struggle with this a lot sometimes when you don't really have a person to give you feedback on what you are doing. If you are starting on with something, it's kind of hard to understand where you're at, what are you good, what are you bad, what needs to be improved. And if you don't really have any experience, as usually happens when you're just starting with something, you really need someone to help you out, you know. And in this specific case, clearly he was sitting next to the professors who would be asking him, so they would always clearly give him an instant feedback. And in this case it would be super simple, like if he's calling out the numbers wrong, he goes 2 numbers back. Then clearly there is a specific time when he needed to stay focused for a long period of time. Pretty much the whole session was lasting for about an hour. So this was the time when he pretty much was fully isolated from all the other things that may have been bothering him. And I think this is also something that I personally struggle sometimes, that it's sometimes getting harder to focus. In his case, clearly he was put in the position where he's going into the room, sitting with the professors who are asking him the questions, so he sort of was fully isolated and was solely focused on calling out those numbers. And clearly, the last but not the least, in order to continue your improvement, you need to feel a certain level of discomfort, you know. In this specific case, clearly, if he wasn't able to pass through a certain wall, that was sort of a discomfort that he was feeling every time, because who wants to feel of themselves as kind of a, you know, that there is a limit to their abilities, and of course we all can be accepting of certain things, but luckily Steve wasn't this kind of person who would just give up easily, and he definitely was feeling discomfort every time he would name the number incorrectly. He went back and continued this memory torture that he needed to go through just in order to actually test his abilities and understand, and that's what it is. And especially what also helped to amplify his level of belief in himself is that he was kind of rational about his abilities, in the sense of, okay, so for example, if they were also trying to change different things, maybe changing the tempo in which the numbers would be spoken out, and there was an example of already having the certain numbers in a row, and again there was another wall that Steve wasn't able to go through at a certain point of a time, but then when experimenters, they started to say the numbers a bit slowly, they saw that actually Steve can remember them, so that it was easier. So it wasn't that his memory wasn't working properly, is that he needed to come up with another rule that would allow him to pass through this point. So it's not as if like there is a human capacity, there is nothing you can do about it, but rather you need to come up with a more creative idea of how you can overcome this obstacle. And this level of discomfort is something that usually makes you come up with a certain way to get out of this and move forward. So that's really what the purposeful practice is. But it still feels kind of slow, and while this practice definitely works, and Steve, as we already said, was able to achieve up to 82 numbers in a row, probably a more efficient way, what the Anders Ericsson determined with his colleagues is that if there is also an expert help component, that allows people to achieve the results faster. So for example, in this specific case, there was another friend of Steve, Dario, who was also doing the running, and Steve explained him his mnemonic rules of how he would remember in the numbers. So Dario also started to participate in the experiment, and at the point of a time, he really managed to have a greater progress than Steve from the very beginning, and then after achieving a certain level of numbers, he actually realized that the rules that Steve relayed to him weren't really applicable anymore, and he felt they're not efficient enough. So he managed to even tweak those new rules that he learned from Steve in order to go all the way to 100 plus numbers in a row, which was still quite a great result. Because, what I would say, quite a great result, I don't think any of my listeners, or at least not myself for sure, can remember 100 numbers in a row, but those guys could. And there are even competitions where people could even remember much more than 100 in a row, and people are actually practicing and training their memories, and this is part of the sport. So, and we really as people manage to remember these things and expand this from the practice. Of course, I'm not saying that something that we would call a prodigy, they don't exist, but we would sometimes attribute this to like specific abilities that people were born with, and I know one would argue that prodigies still exist, but for example, Mozart was considered to be a prodigy, but we all know how hard his father was in his determination to make Mozart one of the greatest musicians of his time, musicians and composers. So it was really the goal that his father was making him practice since he was, I believe, 2 or 3 years old, to practice on piano, to then writing his own music, even though that also kind of semi-mysterious, and maybe consider that his father actually was writing most of the stuff when he was still super young. But anyway, Mozart really managed to achieve his greatness through the practicing. And something that we also call the perfect pitch is also not something that necessarily people were born with. The studies that Anders Ericsson did again show that pretty much, even though of course it's way easier to learn a child to have a perfect pitch, it's still possible to do this with the adults, and even with the adults within considerable age. I believe there was an older person, maybe in his 60s, who was really dedicated to learn the perfect pitch, or maybe a bit younger than that actually. But still, the person who was never regarded as having a perfect pitch. They were able, through the practicing, through I think like a few months of practicing, he was able to understand which notes as which when certain notes were being played. It just feels like sometimes we may attribute too much for the talent, and we may attribute too much for our human nature abilities, Sometimes we would really perceive ourselves as weak or not talented enough if something is not really working out in our favor. And that also kind of happened with even quite talented people. For example, again, referring back to Carol Dweck, who wrote The Mindset, which I think is also super important because part of the purposeful practice is that when you feel in this moment of discomfort and when you feel that you're already working at your abilities, you're thinking that you can actually push through and persevere whatever difficulties you currently have helps you become better. And again, back to the book examples. One of the examples was with the tennis player, sorry, I forgot his name, who was regarded to be super talented, but he definitely put a lot of practice in what he was been doing. But what prevented him from achieving the legendary status in the world, like, we all may remember Andre Agassi, or at this point Roger Federer, Rafa Nadal, Novak Djokovic, or other people. This guy was also regarded to be super talented, but most of the times when he would fail, he would usually not try to accept the current events and try to make himself better, maybe become much more focused, maybe train something else. He would usually think of other ways to blame anything but himself and anything but others when he wasn't able to achieve the results people expected even from him. Then it also kind of answers the question that the talent itself is not enough. The person, in this specific case with this tennis player, was regarded as super talented, perhaps not a prodigy. I suppose he wasn't like that young already, and maybe in tennis you cannot be 10 and play equally with people who are much more experienced of you just because of the power nature of the sport where you need to swing your rackets. I'm terrible at tennis as well, so maybe I'm saying something wrong. But hey, yeah, that person was super talented, but because of his limitations that he put on himself, he wasn't able to become the GOAT, the greatest of all times, just because of the way he wanted to go about the obstacles that are happening around him. And I think what I also believe in terms of the comparability between the talent and success, similar to what fixed mindset and growth mindset are. And I think, as we touched upon before, the fixed mindset people would give up when they feel in the challenge. They would not try hard enough to go through the obstacles. If they feel there is an obstacle, they would probably just ditch it and just drop it at this point. They would feel that effort, especially when person regarded themselves as talented, sometimes you may think that if you need to do something with an effort, and if something before was effortless for you, and at this point you actually need to do something more, you need to push yourself harder, you already consider yourself to be bad. And that exactly the example that happened with that tennis player is that I'm so talented and great, and it's been so easy for me before, then why should I put even more effort now? People would also regard me as not as talented as I was before. And this kind of thinking prevents a lot of people from, improving and getting better. If we continue to expand on this tennis player example, sometimes we may not really listen to the criticism and adequately apply it. I think in most of the cases, we are able to understand when criticism is on point and when criticism is more like a hate speech or whatever, we can clearly or semi-clearly see when something is actually needs the improvement. And I think in most of the times we still understand that something is not that great and something can be better. And one of the ways to become better is to embrace the criticism, take it as your flag, and go ahead and change the things that people believe you can get good at. And I know a lot of artists and creators, they do believe and that there is no ground for criticism sometimes, and that art is art and art needs to be understood as the author saw it. But sometimes it feels like people can get easily insulted when they even get a constructive criticism on something where they can, even on certain technical points, could improve. I think to be able to take the critique and learn from it is super important. And of course, I think it maybe, if we'll be talking about achieving the greatness status and becoming successful and better at something, would be is that we should be so open to see and be happy for the others, to see their success, and not just feeling jealous about it. And don't think that if somebody is successful, that means that you cannot become successful, or you or somebody was lucky, whatever. If you feel like you are now threatened by it, the best way to go about it would be to try to learn from what helped these people to achieve the success. And of course, I know, still luck plays quite a significant factor, I believe, in certain fields. And a lot of different things needs to be met in order to achieve certain status and certain success. But as Seneca said, luck is when preparation meets opportunity. So that is why, even though somebody may deem lucky, it's not as if they were just sitting there and doing nothing, right? Right. So, if we just get back to my intro, I truly believe that I wasn't a person who was purposely practicing guitar. I kind of self-taught myself playing guitar back like 8 years ago, and I was terrible at practicing playing it, especially at the very beginning. I was super struggled because I couldn't play it at all, and the song that I tried to play in the intro was really the song that inspired me to learn to pick up a guitar. But then I think I was kind of young and I didn't have a teacher, and I was so dedicated to go out and learn it myself, which probably kind of was stupid and bold of me. But at the end of the day, that was my mistake, and I believe that if I would have go to the guitar lessons, I would for sure be able to achieve a better result in a sooner amount of time. But then, after you really trying to continue working on something, and I know for me it was such a slow curve, and it was super hard for me to do the barré chords, for example. Now I feel like I'm on a mediocre level doing those, and it's already way better from the 0 level, which I'm kind of being a bit proud about. But I do believe that you would be able to master anything if you'll be applying all these deliberate practice principles. And let's just quickly go for them again. So you should have a specific goal, you should have dedicated intense focus time for this, you should try to get an instant feedback as better as possible, and you still should not feel too comfortable. Probably you better say you should feel the discomfort. And of course, you would become better much faster if you'll be able to attract an expert in the field who would help you to make the progress. Well, on that note, I really curious on your thoughts, guys, down in the comments, and maybe let's try to answer the question: do you really believe that talent is something that given us when we are born, and the true greatness cannot be achieved without the talent? Really curious about your answers. Thank you very much. I'll see you next time.